Welcome back to the Crimson Chat, your go-to show for inspiring stories and fascinating conversations from the heart of the University of Kansas. I'm your host, Jaden Hill, and today we're stepping into the world of music, Broadway stages, Baroque ensembles, and everything in between. Our guest today is Paul Laird, a professor emeritus of musicology at KU. Since 1994, Dr. Laird has shaped generations of students through courses on musical theater, Baroque music, American music, and 20th century music history. He is an internationally recognized scholar of Broadway, Leonard Bernstein, and early string instruments, and an accomplished Baroque cellist himself. Dr. Laird, thank you so much for coming on to the Crimson Chat today.
My pleasure.
We are really excited to have you. And before we dive too much into your research, we'd love to get to know you. So what would you say if someone asked you to describe what you've done and what you do for work?
Well, I guess the first thing I'm saying, I'm a musicologist. In the United States, that mostly means I study music history. I've studied music history in a lot of different times and places. And I'm a passionate teacher. I taught at KU for 30 years and other schools for years before that. And I'm never more comfortable than when I'm in front of a classroom. I just love the process of teaching.
That's really cool. And you mentioned that in the United States, musicology means studying kind of the history of music. Mm-hmm. Does it mean something else elsewhere?
Yeah, actually, in some European countries, the word musicology was supposed to be more all-encompassing. It was supposed to be the idea of music theory, music history, music around the world, but the discipline developed differently here. Music theorists are kind of a camp unto their own. Musicologists tend to be ones who study the history of Western music, United States, Europe, the Americas, and then ethnomusicologists study music more around the world.
Wow, interesting. And what brought you to KU? Before we even started filming, you and I talked a little bit about how you've had appointments at many different universities. How did you end up here?
I did my education I had 2 degrees from Ohio State and 1 from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. They were state universities, large state universities, flagship state universities, and I just loved the atmosphere of those places. I love the democratization that one sees at a state university where you take all kinds of people from all over, some of whom aren't going to have the opportunity to teach or, to study at a really expensive private university, and still giving them a good education and bringing them to another place where they can take their place in the world. And of course the variety of people you run into at a place like this is just fabulous. So when I graduated from North Carolina, I kind of thought I'd love to work at a place like that. And when this opportunity came up, I was interested. My wife's family also is from the Kansas City area, and there's alumni of University of Kansas in my wife's family, and so it was a place I'd already visited and knew a little about.
That's really cool. And you're very accomplished in your field, and like you've mentioned, got multiple degrees. What really steered you towards musicology and music in general? Was it from early childhood this was something that you were interested in, or something that came along later?
Yeah, I've actually a very specific moment in my life. I was a 9th grader. I went to the freshman day of my high school. That is when the freshmen go to find out where their classes are so the upperclassmen can't tell them the wrong place to go. I walked into the orchestra. I played cello. I walked into the orchestra, and in the 5 or 6 minutes, I met this incredibly enthusiastic orchestra director. All of a sudden, music just sounded like the most fascinating thing someone could do. I had a lot of other interests, but I was just really taken with that. And it was her influence that sort of steered me towards music. Now, of course, because of her, I wanted to be a string teacher, but my favorite field was history. And when I ended up at Ohio State, I didn't know what a musicologist was. I'd never heard of one. And then I realized there was somebody teaching a class that combined my 2 favorite things, music and history. So from there it was kind of like, okay, I'll finish the education degree, but after that I'm going on in graduate school in musicology.
Wow, that is really cool that you can pinpoint it to that certain moment. It's very, very exciting. What I think is also really interesting about you is that you're not just a scholar, you're an active musician and cellist. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm an active Baroque cellist. I am first a musicologist. I always loved my cello. When I was working my doctorate, I discovered the idea of period performance, that is, playing an instrument like that which would existed, say, sort of the childhood of Johann Sebastian Bach. The Baroque cello was actually quite different than the modern cello. It doesn't call for me to do the kinds of gymnastics that a cellist has to be able to do in a major symphony orchestra. It gave me the opportunity to play music that I would be able to have the technical facility to play my whole life without being a slave to my cello. And then at KU, another reason I came here was I could direct the Instrumental Collegium Musicum, which played music from the Renaissance and the Baroque and the early classic era, which I had fallen in love with during the course of my graduate studies. And I also played viola da gamba, which is another early string instrument. So I kept my performance emphasis going to the extent that I needed to. And so I could lead my ensemble from the cello. And then my wife and I have had a Baroque group a Baroque performance group in Lawrence for a long time. And I just couldn't put it down. I enjoyed it very much. And I found that it, because I was teaching classes on Baroque music, the fact that I performed it really helped me know more about it and know it from the inside and not just studying it from the outside.
How did you find this Baroque music and instruments and get into this period playing, if you will?
Well, when I went to my doctorate in chapel, I started playing the Collegium Musicum at Ohio State. And when I got to North Carolina, the same year I got there, they'd hired a new cellist who was a Baroque cellist. And I'd always thought it would be fun to try. And I started taking lessons from him. And I fell in love with the sound. I always loved the Baroque music. But it was really the influence of that guy at North Carolina, Brent Wisick.
That's really cool. And also, as we mentioned, you are a cellist, but you're also a scholar, and you've done a lot of research into Leonard Bernstein. What first drew you to this research, and what does that research really consist of?
Well, I discovered Bernstein when I was, a kid. I fell in love with West Side Story. It's still my favorite show. It's still my favorite desert island piece. If I was told you can only take one score and one recording with you to a desert island the rest of your life, it's West Side Story, without a doubt. So that was part of it. I saw the first production of it. I think I was in 8th grade. And then when I was in high school, I had some opportunities to perform some of his music, and it just hit me at a very deep level. I loved it. There was a piece called Chichester Psalms that we did in an all-state orchestra in New Jersey that, I just couldn't believe there was music this wonderful and this beautiful and that spoke to me so much from stuff that was today. Because remember, that was 1976, and the piece was written in 65. At the time, it was, very recent music. And I wanted to know more about this guy. And of course, he didn't only write music. He was one of the greatest conductors of his period. And he's also a figure who was on television all the time. There's just so many different aspects to the man's life. I've found him a figure of endless satisfaction in terms of finding out more about him. There's about 6 or 7 books out there with my name on them that have at least something to do with Bernstein. So I think everybody knows at this point it's an obsession.
I feel like you almost have to be obsessed with your research, at least a little bit.
Yes, no.
And Bernstein is a very interesting character, being that he has had so many hands in different buckets. Like you mentioned, he was an educator, he was a composer, he did all these different things. Can you talk a little bit about certain books that you've written over him? What has been the focus
I did a biography of him for Reaction Books. It's a firm in London. It was a short biography that came out in his centenary year. He was born in 1918, and that was 2018. I've done I've done 3 books that have to do with West Side Story. One on West Side Story in Spain that I wrote with a collaborator in Spain. My friend and I co-edited the Cambridge Companion to West Side Story. And I also wrote a book that involved the orchestration of West Side Story. So, and then I wrote a book on Chichester Psalms, that piece that I was talking about earlier. So, I've looked at them from several different angles, and there's a few others that I'd actually still like to do if I live long enough and have time.
That's exciting. And West Side Story is really interesting because I feel most people, not everyone, most people at least have an idea of West Side Story. There's some connection to it. And your research does focus it on being, transcultural and intergenerational. What is it about West Side Story that's different?
Well, first of all, it's based on Romeo and Juliet. which, let's face it, that's got to be one of the root stories of Western civilization, And most people know what's on Romeo and Juliet, and even if they don't, the story hits you the same way Romeo and Juliet does. Second of all, the music is so compelling. I mean, I've listened, I go to Broadway musical, I go to shows all the time. I know many, many scores. And now I agree this is not a completely unbiased statement, but I find the music to West Side Story more compelling than virtually any show I've ever heard. It describes the two gangs so well. It describes the love between Tony and Maria so well. I mean, there's just so much music in it that after hearing it as many times as I have, and remember, I don't only listen to it, I hear it in my head all the time too, I still find it fascinating. So, it is music that has spoken to me at a very deep level. But, and the other thing is, which, is kind of unfortunate, the gang violence that's described in West Side Story, have we solved this? No. The problems, the problems of race hatred that are described in that show, they're still with us, and they're not only in the United States, they're all over the world. So it's a show that an awful lot of people are going to look at and go, yeah, I get it. I see that.
Well, and that brings me to my next question, because I think that sometimes musicals or Broadway pieces are sometimes, discredited because they're popular, right?
Yeah.
Or discredited because it's, it's just a musical. What is your, counter argument to that, to how deep and impactful these pieces are?
Well, it's kind of like, oh, it's not serious music, it's popular music. Well, first of all, popular music is not simple. Anybody who knows anything about popular music knows the people who make it are very serious musicians, because often what they're doing is just as complicated it's just as sophisticated as what's going on in, the most serious classical music. It's just different. Musical style, there's so many musical styles in this world. You can't count them, and every one of them has something about it that is very complex and sophisticated. In a Broadway musical, there's so many different musical styles, first of all. Even in a rock musical, you'll find all kinds of different popular musical styles, not just rock. That in itself is exciting about a musical, because you have this whole range of musical styles. I would just say that, if you don't think musicals are complicated, you just haven't thought about the process enough. Orchestration, the people who do that, they have to know the range and what sounds good on every one of those instruments, how those instruments combine, and then even more importantly, we're telling a story here. How is this music going to help advance the story? How is this music going to tell us about the characters? And a good bit of my study has been involved in that. How does orchestration help inform us about what's going on stage, what's going on in the characters' heads? It's just as complicated as any opera. It's in a different musical style.
And you mentioned this is incredibly complicated. There's so many different influences that influence how this piece is not only just put together, but then also demonstrated. Is there anything that's particular to American musicals compared to other, styles around the world?
Well, when we talk about American musicals, we almost have to talk about the Anglo-American musical, because what goes on in England is very, very impactful about what goes on here, and vice versa. Lots of shows have played in both London's West End and in Broadway and all over the English-speaking world. That style of musical, the mixture of music and speaking as it exists, the use of dance to help tell the story, this has become popular all over the world. There are American musicals and British musicals playing in South Korea and Germany and Austria and France and Spain. Another one of my interests is the Anglo-American musical in Spain, because I started off writing about Spanish Baroque music, and later in my career I just kind of combined Spain with the musical. So I was just in Spain in January to see Wicked, because Wicked had just opened in Spain. And I'm right now writing some things about Wicked in Spain. And it's the style of musical that we associate with Broadway and with the West End. It's become popular in many different places. And that when people say the words musical theater, that's often what they're thinking about, although of course musical theater is a very wide thing that goes to opera, from opera all the way back to vaudeville and stuff. But it's just, it's a compelling art form which tells stories, and people love music. I mean, they love to hear how music can influence that storytelling.
And narrative is so powerful. I mean, how is it not, so popular? I mean, if you have this narrative story, but also this amazing music, along with the visual of dance and a set and all these other things, I mean, it just makes sense that it would be
And just
popular.
think how important music is to people. I mean, let's face it, it's absurd for two lovers to start singing at each other. I mean, if you started singing to your significant other in the real world, they'd think you were very strange. And yet there's something about us that just loves that dynamic, loves the way it's expressing that feeling. But it's not just the love, of course. I mean, politics, as we said in West Side Story, the various issues that are brought up there. Songs about those things, you can sometimes say to people things through song that are very difficult to just say out loud. The music, the combination of the music and the lyrics, it hits us in a different place.
And you mentioned something, you've studied everything from Baroque music to modern West Side Story musicals. This is a wide range. How do you make those connections?
Well, I mean, the easiest thing to say is it's all music, but mostly it reflects my interests. I feel very lucky that I've gotten to work in several different areas. When they were hiring my replacement here, one of my colleagues said, "What are we going to do? You're a unicorn." Meaning that you just, nobody does what you did. But there's a lot of musicologists who've worked in several different areas. Mine are pretty far apart, but again, it's basically reflects my interests in wanting to learn what music meant either in that time or in that place or in that society. What music sounded like. I mean, my interest in Baroque cello and in period instruments has to do with the fact the instruments were very different in the period when that music was written. They didn't sound like they do today. And I mean, in some cases, it wasn't even close because technology has changed. A lot of it has to do with technology and what we can build now and everything. But still, even string instruments, which are, they look the same, but the strings are made out of different things and they're played differently, and the rooms they're played in are larger, so they've been made to be louder. It just fascinates me to try to get some idea what that music sounded like during that period. So yeah, I am that unicorn, but I've only worked on things that I was really fascinated by and wanted to know more about in terms of some question involving music history.
So I'm curious, you've mentioned this kind of revival of the Baroque pieces and instruments. What do you think is causing that? Why is there this revival?
Well, it mostly, it started in the classical musical world because people were aware that what the music they were hearing did not sound like it sounded like in the period. We hear a lot of Bach played on piano. Well, the piano that it's being played on is a creature in the middle of the 19th century, 100 years after Bach died. In Bach's day, it was mostly be playing on a harpsichord or clavichord, two very different instruments, or a piano that doesn't sound anything like the modern piano. So, your question becomes, what did it sound like when it was made in his day? So it was mostly in the 1960s and 70s. A lot of basic research started to be done on what the instruments were like in the earlier period and how can we construct them in that way. You have to be careful. Some people want to call it authentic. Authenticity is a very difficult thing to find. And of course, since no one was recording the music in Bach's day, we don't know what it really sounded like. But I find it fascinating to try to get closer to what it sounded like. And then when you start doing that, you start finding out that you learn a great deal from the music and how to play it and what the music is giving you.
Do you think there's any connection to the modern, I might even say, obsession with period pieces, whether that be books, movies, that type of thing? Or do you think there's any connection, or do you think it's fully separate because there's more scholarly?
No, I think it's more of a separate thing. It's not there are certainly period instrumentalists and singers who have made a big splash and have done things in the larger classical musical world. But a period instrument orchestra is a very different thing than a modern orchestra, and as you can imagine, there is competition between them, because the modern orchestras, no, we don't sound like you, but we're what most people listen to. Period performance is a smaller corner of classical music, and classical music, of course, is not as it was a bigger part of society 100 years ago than it is now. I mean, popular music has, it's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, but it's a thing. If you'd gone to school 100 years ago, they would have been playing Beethoven for you in the classroom because they would have thought it would make you a better person. I mean, classical music had this patina around it that doesn't exist for most people like it used to. So because you've got a slightly smaller classical music base of interest, the period music, it's kind of off in a corner by itself. But I don't think it's going away because there are certainly people still interested in that kind of sound.
Do you feel like teaching different types of music is similar, different? Are there overlaps in your teaching styles?
There's certainly your teaching style doesn't change. I mean, whether I'm teaching Bernstein or something about the Baroque or the Middle Ages, I'm trying to bring to it the same kind of thing that way. I mean, that's always similar. That's always similar. But of course, you have to approach it using thinking about that period and the kinds of things the students need to know about. And let's face it, if you're talking about music now, people know about now. They don't know about the past. So if you're talking about Johann Sebastian Bach, you're going to have to say some things to try to make his world come alive. There are interesting connections between them. I mean, there are musical techniques that go between the periods. I suppose the best example is in the Baroque, they always had this thing called the basso continuo. They wrote a bass line out. The bass line was played by a melody bass instrument like a cello or a bassoon. And the keyboard player played that in the left hand. In the right hand, they improvised chords that would provide the harmony to the music. This is exactly what's done in a jazz band, where you've got an electric bass and a keyboard. It's done in a rock band. It's done in an awful lot of popular music. We just don't call it the basso continuo anymore. So there are a lot of musical techniques to go between periods, and you have to bring those things out. If you want to bring the Baroque alive for modern young people, you have to point out, see, this is still here.
Wow, and I haven't really thought about that. My roommate plays in a jazz band, and so it's funny that you say that because I was like, oh, I've heard her talk about these different things. So it's just funny when you were describing that. I was like, oh, I've seen that, which is exactly what you're talking about. I have that immediate connection to, I can see
the rhythm
this
section is the modern extension of that practice that goes back to the late 16th century.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
And to move a little bit to your teaching, you mentioned how your teaching style doesn't really change. You've received a lot of major teaching awards at KU. You had the W.T. Kemper Fellowship for Teaching and Excellence, the Chancellor's Club Career Teaching Award. What does teaching mean to you, and what does your pedagogy look like?
Well, I'm a lecturer, which makes me an old-style teacher, and it's not that I can't lead discussions, but I've always enjoyed the challenge of bringing it alive for classes. I'm a very enthusiastic teacher. Some people probably think I'm a crazy teacher. I don't stand still. I walk all over the room. I grew up in a family that loves puns, so I've always used a lot of puns in class. One would say I go for Baroque a lot in the class. But the most important thing to me is trying to communicate with the students where they are, and in order to do that, you have to ask questions that you're trying to engage people with the material. You have to make the music come alive for them in a particular way, and you have to be looking at people's faces to see if they're connecting with what you're doing. I was most influenced by teachers who were really enthusiastic, and that fit my personality very well. So I've always been that way, and I've always wanted to try to be there for the students in any way that I could. Some requests are impossible, but I spent a lot of time mentoring and speaking with students who wanted to talk to me. My mother's family was a family of teachers, so I think it was partly in my blood. But I still love to teach. I teach the classes for retirees. I do a lot with the Osher Institute of Lifelong Learning here at KU, and that's an awful lot of fun. They're fascinated, and there's no exams. They like the fact that there's no exams since I'm retired. I like the fact that I don't have to grade papers. There was a point in your life where you've probably graded enough papers, and I reached that point a few years ago.
And Also, I think it's really interesting. You've taught internationally. You've taught in Ecuador, in Europe, in the U.S., at multiple different universities. Has teaching in different places affected the way you teach?
Oh yeah,
Yeah?
absolutely. I mean, you can't change the person that you are, but it's fascinating to see that students are pretty similar all over the world. Their experiences might be very different, but the way they present themselves and the kind of questions they ask are similar. It gives you an appreciation for where you are, because you learn what things are like in other places, and you come home and look at the place that you are in a different way. But I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating to go in another culture and see how music works there, and get to talk to students and interact with people who do come from very different backgrounds. But again, it's a lot of fun to see how similar their concerns are. But also how different music could be in their own societies.
Looking back at your career, is there a certain publication or project that really stands out to you?
Yeah, well, I've done a lot. But what affected my life the most was the Cambridge Companion to the Musical, because up to that point, I was known as a scholar of the Spanish villancico. And I loved musical theater, and this wonderful project kind of fell in my lap, and it ended up going to 3 editions. And it came out, the first one came out in 2002, just when serious scholarship of musical theater was kind of getting started. So this was it became kind of a really important publication. I mean, I didn't write the whole thing. It was a collection of essays by scholars, and a friend of mine and I co-edited it. He was a Jayhawk too. He did his doctorate here. That was what all of a sudden, Paul Laird's associated with musical theater scholarship, and that opened up so many doors for me. I wasn't planning on leaving the Spanish villancico, but all of a sudden most of my opportunities were coming in musical theater. So for the last quarter century, I've basically been a musical theater scholar.
So someone is new to musical theater. What would you tell them? What advice would you give them to really access the depth that we've talked about kind of throughout this interview?
Well, you have to go see a lot of shows. You don't have to go to New York and pay $100 for tickets. They happen in Kansas City. They happen around you. You need to get to know the repertory. You can't see 3 shows and say you know musical theater. You need to get to know the ones from the past, ones that aren't being done anymore because they've influenced what we have now. Like a lot of fields, there's not much new. Almost everything that happens now has happened in the past. And you need to know that. And you also just, you need to figure out why this interests you. Musical theater, it's such a varied, so many different arts go into it, and people come to it from different angles, and you need to figure out which angle is most interesting to you. In anything you're working on in music, you absolutely cannot know enough repertory. The more shows you know, the more you'll be able to figure out what's going on. And I mean, I don't care what you're studying, symphonies, opera, ballet, you just have to get to know repertory.
Do you feel like there is a major difference watching something in New York on Broadway compared to at the Kansas City Theater, compared to maybe the Lawrence, public theater?
Well, it comes in different levels, The best people are working on Broadway and in the touring productions. Usually if you see a show in Kansas City, it's not unlike seeing it in New York. The venue may be very different, but still what you're seeing on stage is usually intended as the best copy they can make of the show in New York and still be able to tour it, So there are compromises and sets and things that they do, but so I think if you're seeing the best touring stuff, you're basically seeing the kind of thing you'll see on Broadway or the West End. When you're going to Theater Lawrence, you're seeing enthusiastic local people put on the show. Often very, very talented. It's very different than seeing professionals at it, although sometimes professionals work there as well. When you're or at another local venue or at our high school, you're seeing the best production they can put on, which is a very different thing than seeing people who do this every day of their lives. But often you still get a very good idea how the show works and what it has to bring to the table.
You mentioned before when we were chatting, and also a couple times during this interview, how much you like being a part of the KU community. What is it about KU that you find so wonderful?
Well, as I said, it's the state university thing. I've also really enjoyed working the School of Music here. It's a full-service School of Music. You know, they have music education, music therapy, performance on various instruments at the undergraduate and graduate levels, all of those things. And that. I mean, it's not a rare thing in this country, but it's a wonderful, very interesting place to work with lots of stimulation in various areas and really interesting colleagues. Some of them do very, very different things than what I do. So I've loved that. I like being in a large school with a lot of facilities and possibilities, and I've really enjoyed the students here. And I love Lawrence. I've lived many places, and Lawrence, when we got here, my wife said to me, "You're going to have to like it here because we're staying." Fortunately, I agreed with her, you know, because it's a very compelling community that has a lot of interesting, varied people and a lot of great stuff going on in not that large of a town.
It is really cool to be here, even coming from Western Kansas, where I'm from.
Yeah.
It's just a special and different community,
Yeah.
so absolutely, I agree. Well, Dr. Laird, thank you so much for sharing your passion with us this morning. Thank you for coming and talking to us about music, exploring how it's not just entertainment, but it's history, it's scholarship,
Yeah.
it's just human connection, really.
Yeah.
And to our listeners, thank you guys for tuning in to the Crimson Chat. Join us next time for another conversation with scholars, artists, and leaders that are shaping the University of Kansas and the world. We'll see you then.